Dear friends, Jesuit education is almost 500 years old, and through centuries old experiences, the Society of Jesus, which is popularly known as the Jesuits, have brought out almost 9 characteristics of our education. And the following are the characteristics which we have identified. The number 1 is Jesuit education assists in the total formation of each individual within the human community. Number 2, it talks about prepares for an active life commitment. Number 3, it serves the faith that does justice. Equity is a great concern of Jesuit education. It also talks about making men and women for others. It also talks about awakens the particular concern for the poor. It also very much stresses on a religious dimension that permeates the entire education. Definitely, the Jesuit education focuses on a value orientation. It encourages us a realistic knowledge, love and acceptance of self, and also it forms men and women of competence, conscience and compassionate commitment. So this is what we do in and through Jesuit education in our schools and education institutions. Now, why I have brought out these 9 points? In the key principles of the National Education Policy 2020, we can identify all these points in principle. The National Education Policy 2020 talks about an education which is for the future, a future-centered, child-centered, multiple intelligence-based education. In that education, it has placed 8 key principles for us to follow. The first principle it talks about is the respect for diversity and local context. It has to be reflected in all curriculum, pedagogy and policy of education. It's a very important thing that diversity has to be highlighted, that has to be the permeating force behind any policy or curriculum and pedagogy in our educational system in India. It also talks about equity and inclusion to become the connections of all educational decisions. Equity means equal opportunity for all, irrespective of one's culture, ethnicity, religion, economic status, gender, etc. We need to give education for everybody. That is why equity comes in. Equity is also, I think, it can be translated as justice. Our education must be right-based, justice-oriented education. That's what this education policy, at least in its principles, talking about. The third key principle the Education Policy 2020 talks about is community participation. Uplifting philanthropic private community participation is stressed, and I think a participation of people in the school, the running of the school is very, very important and vital for any successful educational endeavor. Because we study, every school is a miniature society. Schools are integral part of the society in which the people of that locality must be part of the schools, especially to running of the schools. What happens is today it becomes very negative interference, politically motivated groups, etc. That is what is a hurdle for us. But otherwise, community participation is very, very desirable. The fourth key principle in our new education policy talks about is the use of technology in teaching and learning, removing language barriers, etc. Now, use of technology is very, very important, because we know in this pandemic period itself, we have realized how important is the use of technology. But at the same time, we have understood that how challenging this task for us is, because there is a huge digital divide existing in our country. Many of our areas have still a regular electricity connection. Internet is not reached out to many of our people. So technology is a boon, at the same time it is going to be a challenge for us. And I think government is stressing on that one in the educational arena, and I am sure that we will have to look for ways and means to use technology in an affordable way, and it is reaching out to everybody in our society. The fifth educational principle, the key principles of the National Education Policy 2020 is emphasis on conceptual understanding, learning for exams with no rote learning. In our education system as of now is not much of a conceptual learning. What happens is more or less our education is meant for examinations. An examination oriented education is what we are giving, and children learn through memory based education, and therefore what happens is we forget the importance of the concept, whether the student understood the subject which they are learning conceptually or not. In many of the places it has been proved that a 5th standard student studying in a government school is unable to read the textbook of standard 2 or doing the sum in a mathematical calculation of standard 2, etc. This is a serious concern, and therefore as a 5th key principle, a rote learning should be replaced by emphasis on conceptual understanding, and education must change. The 6th key principle it is talking about is a unique capabilities, recognizing and tapping them in each student. All of us know now, psychology has proved, educational psychology has proved that every child is unique, and every child has a unique contribution. There is a trait, there is a giftedness, for example. There is a particular way of learning, for example, that has to be understood, and we need to pay attention to these unique capabilities of children. Today, with the help of this multiple intelligence, it's easy for us to understand. There are 9 types of intelligences according to Howard Gardner. He talks about multiple intelligences based education, and I think this is the modern trend, and our education policy makers have understood this. In fact, when we suggested about education, the future of Indian education, etc., as part of the draft education policy, we have suggested, in our suggestions we have written very clearly, multiple based education policy must be followed in India, understanding the trait, one's own aptitude and one's of learning style. That has come into the principle at least. And the 7th key principles it is talking about is critical thinking and creativity must be given. In all our education system, we must enable our children to think critically. Do not simply giving a memory based rote learning in terms of somebody is saying something and children will simply gulp that one and reproduce it. No. There should be critical thinking. Any situation in life, we must have the critical thinking. Critical thinking is also enabling our own ability to get an opinion based on our own conviction, not because of the majority opinion. And therefore, critical thinking and also creativity. Actually, human life must be creative. Always we must be able to create something new in an innovative way, and that is taken into consideration of these key principles of education policy 2020, and this will help us to have more of decision making and innovation. I think this is a wonderful suggestion, critical thinking, which is much needed in India today. And finally, the 8th key principle, it talks about continuous review. Build on sustained research and regular assessment by educational experts. We need, one of the things in India we need is research. We need to have more of critical study. We need a response must be based on a studied way. Documentary evidence must be there. We must have an overall perception, not one-sided or politically colored or religiously oriented. As educationists, in our all endeavors must be free. And I think this education policy 2020 gives these 8 key principles as a very, very strong point for us in introducing our education institutions. These 8 principles, if it is followed well, I am sure Indian education will have a better future, and this educational system will bring a very, very focused way of creating India, as it is in the vision said, a superpower in terms of high quality education based on equity and Indian ethos. Let's hope that these principles will be implemented in and through the pages of this policy. And as I always say, any policy is as good as its implementation. Maybe in the paper these 8 policies are looking so wonderful. Hope that will be also in execution happen. Thank you very much, and God bless all of you.